Distinguished viewers, there exists in the grand tapestries of history certain threads so dark, so carefully woven, that to pull even one might unravel the very fabric of an empire. Tonight, I invite you into the gaslit corridors of Belmont House, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows and whispered conversations carry the weight of kingdoms. Here, behind masks of propriety and beneath layers of silk and velvet, moves a figure so enigmatic that even I, who have witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties, find myself both fascinated and terrified by her presence. The year was 1847, and London's elite had gathered for what they believed would be merely another glittering soiree. Little did they know that among them walked a woman whose very existence threatened to topple the carefully constructed pedestals upon which their reputations stood. She moved with the grace of a phantom, her identity concealed behind an exquisite mask of black lace and midnight silk, yet her presence commanded attention in ways that no title or fortune ever could. Lady Margaret Ashworth, the evening's hostess, had spared no expense in transforming her ancestral home into a palace worthy of royalty. The grand ballroom stretched before guests like a cathedral of opulence, its vaulted ceilings painted with cherubs and adorned with gold leaf that caught the light of 1,000 candles. Massive mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces reflecting not only the splendor of the gathering, but also the carefully hidden anxieties that flickered across aristocratic faces. The orchestra, positioned on a marble platform overlooking the dance floor, played a haunting waltz that seemed to weave through the air like silk ribbons. Couples moved in perfect synchronization, their steps following patterns established by generations of breeding and training. Yet tonight, there was an undercurrent of tension that even the most accomplished dancers could not mask. Among the glittering assemblage stood Duke Reginald Whitmore, his imposing figure draped in the finest midnight blue velvet, a diamond-encrusted cravat pin catching the candlelight. At 62, he commanded respect through both his ancient bloodline and his vast financial empire. Yet tonight, his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he lifted his crystal goblet of champagne to his lips. His steel-gray eyes swept the room with an intensity that spoke of a man searching for something, or someone. Beside him, Countess Victoria Pemberton maintained her reputation as society's most gracious hostess, her emerald silk gown a masterpiece of Worth's atelier. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate chignon, adorned with a tiara that had graced the heads of Pemberton women for 3 centuries. Yet beneath her practiced smile lay a tension that even her most intimate friends had begun to notice in recent weeks. The conversation that evening centered, as it often did, around the usual topics: the latest fashions from Paris, speculation about the Queen's health, and the ongoing debates in Parliament. Yet there was something else, a name that was whispered in corners, a presence that was felt rather than seen, a story that everyone knew fragments of but no one dared speak aloud. The veiled chronicler, they called her, though never above a whisper. Some claimed she was a displaced princess from a fallen European dynasty. Others believed her to be the bastard daughter of a powerful lord, who had been educated in the shadows before emerging to claim her place in society. What everyone agreed upon was that she possessed an uncanny ability to know things, intimate details about marriages, business dealings, family secrets, and political machinations that should have been impossible for any outsider to discover. Lord Christopher Blackwood, heir to one of England's oldest fortunes, found himself drawn to a conversation near the marble fireplace where several gentlemen had gathered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his burgundy tailcoat fitted to perfection, yet there was something in his demeanor that suggested a man wrestling with demons that no amount of wealth or privilege could banish. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the refined tones of Eton and Oxford, "surely we cannot continue to ignore the elephant in the room. This mysterious woman has somehow infiltrated our most private affairs. Just last week, Lady Thornton received a letter detailing her husband's indiscretions, with information so precise it could only have come from someone present in their own drawing room." The circle of men shifted uncomfortably. Each knew that what Blackwood spoke was true, and each harbored the terrible suspicion that their own secrets might be next to see the light of day. From across the room, a figure approached, tall, elegant, moving with the predatory grace of a panther. The woman wore a gown of deepest burgundy silk that seemed to absorb the light around her, creating an aura of mystery that was both alluring and intimidating. Her face was partially concealed behind an intricate mask of black lace and small diamonds that sparkled like stars against the darkness. Only her eyes were visible, eyes of such an unusual violet hue, that they seemed to pierce through any facade or pretense. As she drew near, conversations gradually fell silent. Not because anyone recognized her. Indeed, her identity remained as mysterious as ever. But because there was something about her presence that demanded attention. She moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through calm waters, leaving ripples of whispered speculation in her wake. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that could have been French, German, or perhaps something more exotic. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. How fascinating that men of such distinguished reputation should be so concerned with the activities of one lone woman." Lord Blackwood straightened, his jaw tightening. "Madam, I'm afraid you have us at a disadvantage. We have not been properly introduced." The mysterious woman smiled, her expression that was visible even behind her mask through the curve of her lips and the light that danced in her violet eyes. "Introductions can be so limiting, don't you think? They reduce us to names, titles, lineages, all the conventional markers that society uses to determine our worth. But what if I told you that worth has nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with knowledge?" The tension in the circle was palpable now. Each man present felt as though they were being evaluated, weighed, and perhaps found wanting by those penetrating violet eyes. "Knowledge, madam, is indeed valuable," Duke Whitmore interjected, his voice steady despite the unease he felt. "But there are different types of knowledge. Some are gained through study and experience, others through less honorable means." "Ah, your grace," the woman replied, and her use of his title without introduction caused several eyebrows to raise. "How quickly we judge the methods by which information is acquired. Tell me, when you learned of your late wife's correspondence with Lord Harrington, was the knowledge any less devastating because it came from your own private investigator rather than from drawing-room gossip?" The Duke's face went white. The information she referenced was known only to 3 people in the world: himself, his dead wife, and the investigator he had paid handsomely both for information and for silence. Yet here this stranger stood, speaking of it as casually as one might discuss the weather. The orchestra had moved into a particularly dramatic piece, its crescendo seeming to underscore the tension that now gripped the small gathering. Around them, other guests continued to dance and converse, blissfully unaware that they were witnessing what might have been the first public appearance of the most feared woman in London. "I think, gentlemen," the mysterious woman continued, "that what truly frightens you is not that I know your secrets, but that I might choose to share them. After all, secrets are only powerful when they remain hidden. Once exposed to daylight, they lose their ability to control and manipulate." Lord Blackwood stepped forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What is it you want? Money? Position? Surely there must be something that would ensure your discretion." The woman's laugh was like silver bells tinkling in a gentle breeze, beautiful, haunting, and somehow chilling. "Oh, my dear Lord Blackwood, if only it were that simple. You see, I'm not interested in your money, though I certainly don't lack for it. Nor am I particularly impressed by your positions, having seen how easily they can be gained and lost." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "What I am interested in is justice. For too long, men like yourselves have used your wealth and position to escape the consequences of your actions. You've destroyed lives, broken hearts, and ruined families, all while hiding behind the protection of your noble names. But shadows, gentlemen, have a way of revealing truth that bright lights cannot." As she spoke, other conversations around them had begun to falter. Guests found themselves drawn to the dramatic scene unfolding, though few could hear the specific words being exchanged. They sensed, however, that something momentous was occurring, that the careful balance of their insular world was being challenged by forces they could neither understand nor control. Countess Pemberton, her emerald gown rustling like autumn leaves, approached the group with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to managing difficult social situations. "Gentlemen, surely this charming conversation can continue over supper? Lady Ashworth has prepared the most exquisite menu, and it would be such a shame to let it grow cold." The mysterious woman turned those violet eyes upon the Countess, and for a moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a challenge. "How gracious of you, your ladyship. Though I wonder if your guests would find their appetites quite so robust if they knew what I know about the source of the Pemberton fortune." The Countess's carefully maintained composure slipped for just an instant, a micro-expression of fear and fury that only the most observant would have caught. But it was enough. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were not dealing with some common blackmailer or social climber. This woman possessed information that could destroy them all. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the orchestra appeared to sense the shift in atmosphere, their music taking on a more ominous tone. Candles flickered in their sconces as if moved by some unfelt wind, casting dancing shadows across the faces of England's most powerful families. "Ladies and gentlemen," the woman said, her voice now carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "I believe it's time for the evening's true entertainment to begin." She moved to the center of the ballroom, her burgundy gown flowing behind her like spilled wine. Every eye was now fixed upon her. Every conversation had ceased. The very air seemed charged with electricity, as if a storm were about to break over their carefully ordered world. "You know," she continued, her voice intimate yet carrying to every corner of the vast room, "I've always found it fascinating how quickly a room full of the most powerful people in England can become silent. It's almost as if you're all waiting for something, or perhaps dreading it. But what could possibly terrify those who controlled the very foundations of empire itself?" The silence that had fallen over the ballroom was not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but rather the heavy stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for lightning to strike. The mysterious woman in burgundy silk had positioned herself at the very heart of the gathering, yet she remained as enigmatic as ever, her identity concealed behind that intricate mask of black lace and diamonds. I had witnessed many such moments in my years observing the intricate dance of high society. Those pivotal instances when the carefully maintained facade of civilization threatens to crumble, revealing the raw human emotions that lurk beneath. But never had I seen an entire room of the most powerful people in England reduced to such vulnerable silence by a single individual. Lady Margaret Ashworth, the evening's hostess, stepped forward with the desperate grace of a woman trying to salvage a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. Her sapphire blue gown, which had seemed so magnificent earlier in the evening, now appeared almost costume-like against the stark drama unfolding in her own ballroom. "My dear guests," she announced, her voice pitched with the forced cheer of someone whistling in a graveyard, "perhaps we should move to the dining room? The chef has prepared such a lovely—" "Oh, but Lady Ashworth," the mysterious woman interrupted, her voice cutting through the pretense like a blade through silk, "surely your guests are far more interested in the menu I have prepared for this evening's entertainment? After all, it's not every day that one has the opportunity to feast upon such revelatory delicacies." She began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the gathered crowd, her movements deliberate and predatory. As she passed each group of guests, conversations died like candles being snuffed out one by one. The very air seemed to shimmer with tension. "Lord Pemberton," she said, her violet eyes fixing upon a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and an impressively waxed mustache. "How lovely to see you this evening. I trust your recent business ventures in India are proving profitable? Though I do wonder what your investors would think if they knew about your rather creative accounting methods." Lord Pemberton's face flushed crimson above his pristine white collar. His wife, the Countess, moved to his side with the protective instincts of a lioness, her emerald eyes flashing with barely controlled fury. "Madam," the Countess said, her voice trembling with indignation, "you go too far. These are serious accusations you're making without foundation or proof." The mysterious woman paused in her circuit of the room, tilting her head with the curious expression of a cat watching a mouse attempt to escape. "Without proof, you say? How interesting that you should assume I make accusations without evidence. Tell me, your ladyship, does the name Colonial Development Associates mean anything to you? Or perhaps you're more familiar with the documentation I possess regarding the, shall we say, creative interpretation of tonnage reports from your shipping concerns?" The blood drained from the Countess's face so rapidly that several guests nearby feared she might faint. The mysterious woman's smile was visible even behind her mask, an expression of such confident satisfaction that it sent chills down the spines of everyone present. Duke Whitmore, his earlier composure now completely shattered, stepped forward with the desperate bravado of a cornered animal. "Enough of this charade. Who are you? What do you want? Name your price and be done with it." "My price?" The woman's laughter was like crystal chimes in a winter wind, beautiful and cold. "Oh, your grace, you still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money. This is about something far more valuable, truth. She moved to the center of the room again. And as she did, I noticed something that even my experienced I had initially missed. The way she carried herself, the precise angle of her head, the particular cadence of her speech. There was something hauntingly familiar about her mannerisms, as if I were watching the ghost of someone I had once known. You see, she continued, her voice now carrying a note of melancholy that seemed at odds with the confrontational nature of her words. I have spent years watching all of you. Years observing how you conduct your business, how you treat those beneath your station, how you use your wealth and influence to shape the world according to your desires, regardless of the cost to others. The grand mirrors that lined the ballroom seemed to multiply her image infinitely, creating the illusion that the room was filled with burgundy-clad figures, each one reflecting a different aspect of the justice she seemed to represent. Lady Morrison, she said, turning to address a woman whose beauty was legendary throughout London society. Your charitable work among the poor of Whitechapel is truly admirable. Though I wonder if your contributors would be quite so generous if they knew that only 10% of their donations actually reach the intended recipients. The rest, I believe, has gone toward maintaining your rather expensive lifestyle, including that lovely chateau you recently purchased in the French countryside under your maiden name. Lady Morrison's carefully applied rouge could not disguise the pallor that overtook her features. Her diamond necklace, which had gleamed so brilliantly in the candlelight, now seemed to weigh upon her throat like a noose. And you, Sir Edmund, the mysterious woman continued, her attention shifting to a portly gentleman who had been attempting to blend into the crowd near the refreshment table. Your innovations in industrial machinery have certainly revolutionized manufacturing. Though I fear your workers might have a different perspective on your achievements, particularly those who have lost limbs to the unsafe conditions you've knowingly perpetuated to maximize profits. Sir Edmund's face had turned the color of ash, and I noticed his hand shaking so violently that he was forced to set down his champagne glass for fear of dropping it. The woman paused again, allowing the weight of her revelations to settle over the gathering like a suffocating blanket. Around the room, I could see the careful social order that had taken generations to establish beginning to crack under the pressure of exposed truths. But perhaps, she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast ballroom, you're all wondering how I came to possess such detailed knowledge of your private affairs? How someone outside your carefully guarded circle could have gained access to information that even your closest confidants don't possess. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and penetrating. I found myself leaning forward slightly, as fascinated as the rest of the gathering by the promise of revelation that seemed to hover just beyond reach. The answer, she continued, is simpler than you might think, yet more devastating than you could possibly imagine. You see, I haven't been watching you from outside your circle at all. Her hand moved slowly to the ribbons that secured her mask, her fingers tracing the delicate fabric with deliberate care. The entire room seemed to lean forward in anticipation, as if collectively holding its breath. I have been among you all along. The revelation struck the gathering like a physical blow. Conversations erupted in harsh whispers as guests turned to one another with wild speculation. Who among them had been living a double life? Which of their trusted friends had been gathering secrets like a spider spinning its web? Lord Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos. Impossible. We know everyone here. Every invitation was personally approved, every guest's credentials verified. Oh, my dear Christopher, the woman said, using his given name with a familiarity that made several guests gasp. You still think in terms of formal invitations and social credentials. But tell me, how does one verify the identity of a ghost? The candles in their sconces seemed to flicker more violently now, casting wild shadows that danced across the painted ceiling like demonic figures. The orchestra, unsure whether to continue playing, had allowed their music to fade to a whispered tremolo that seemed to underscore the supernatural quality of the evening's events. You see, the mysterious woman continued, death has a way of liberating one from the constraints of identity. When society believes you are gone, you become free to observe from the shadows, to move through the world unseen and unrecognized. It's quite remarkable how much people will reveal when they believe no one is watching. The implication of her words hit the gathering like a tsunami. If she had indeed been presumed dead, then she could be anyone, a wife, a daughter, a sister whose supposed demise had freed her to exact revenge upon those who had wronged her or her family. Countess Pemberton stepped forward, her emerald gown rustling with agitation. This is madness. You speak in riddles and threats. If you have accusations to make, then make them plainly. Very well, the woman replied, her violet eyes gleaming with something that might have been satisfaction. Let us speak plainly indeed. She began to remove her gloves, revealing hands that bore the pale marks of rings that had been worn for years. Rings that had clearly been part of her identity before whatever transformation had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she said, her voice now carrying a weight of emotion that made the air itself seem to vibrate. A young woman threw herself from the cliffs of Dover. At least, that was the story told to the world. The daughter of a respected family, driven to despair by scandal and shame, choosing death over dishonor. The room had become so quiet that the crackling of candles sounded like gunshots. Every person present was calculating, trying to remember which families had suffered such tragedies, which young women had met such dramatic ends. But what if I told you, she continued, that the woman who died that day was not driven to suicide by shame, but by the deliberate, calculated destruction of her reputation by men who wanted her family's wealth and would stop at nothing to obtain it? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, and it was a picture that terrified everyone present. Because if this woman had indeed returned from a presumed death to exact justice upon those who had wronged her, then no secret was safe, no crime would go unpunished. What if I told you that she had spent these 5 years not in death, but in careful preparation, learning your habits, gaining access to your private papers, befriending your servants, becoming intimate with every detail of your lives that you thought were hidden from the world? She paused, allowing her hand to rest upon the ribbons of her mask once more. The gesture was simple, yet it held the promise of revelation that would change everything. But who among the gathered elite had destroyed a young woman's life so completely that she had chosen to disappear rather than fight back? And what terrible justice was she prepared to exact now that she had returned? The atmosphere in the grand ballroom had become so charged with tension that I half expected to see actual lightning crackling between the crystal chandeliers. The mysterious woman in burgundy silk stood at the epicenter of what was rapidly becoming the most dramatic confrontation London society had witnessed in decades. Her violet eyes moved across the assembled guests with the precision of a master chess player contemplating her next move, each glance seeming to strip away another layer of carefully constructed pretense. The weight was becoming unbearable. Hands that had held champagne glasses with aristocratic ease now trembled with barely controlled anxiety. Fans that had fluttered with practiced elegance now moved with the frantic rhythm of hummingbird wings. The very air seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of England's most powerful families, all of whom were beginning to realize that their carefully guarded secrets might be about to become public knowledge. Before I reveal my identity, the woman said, her voice carrying that same haunting accent that no one had yet been able to place, perhaps you would indulge me in a small game? After all, games of chance and skill are so popular among your set, are they not? She began to move again, her burgundy gown flowing behind her like liquid wine. As she walked, she spoke, her words weaving a spell of suspense that held every person in the room captive. Let us call it the game of consequences. I will present you with scenarios, situations that some of you will recognize as painfully familiar. And we shall see how well you remember the choices you made and the prices that others paid for your ambitions. Duke Whitmore, his earlier attempt at bravado now completely abandoned, stepped forward with the desperate air of a man trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his influence. Madam, whatever grievances you may have, surely they can be settled through proper channels. If wrongs have been committed, there are legal remedies. Legal remedies? The woman's laughter cut through his words like a blade through silk. Oh, Your Grace, how naively you speak of justice for one who has spent decades ensuring that the law serves only those with sufficient wealth to purchase its favor. She turned to face him directly, and even through her mask, the intensity of her gaze was unmistakable. Tell me when you foreclosed on the Hartwell estate, knowing full well that the family had already paid their debts to your banks, but you had simply mislaid the documentation, did you consider legal remedies for the family you destroyed? Or when you arranged for young Thomas Hartwell to be impressed into naval service to prevent him from presenting evidence of your fraud, did you consider the justice you were denying? The Duke's face went through a transformation that was visible to everyone present. from confusion to recognition to absolute terror. The name Hartwell had clearly struck a nerve, bringing with it memories that he had obviously spent considerable effort trying to suppress. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hushed murmur that had begun to ripple through the crowd. "The Hartwell line. They all. The ship was lost in a storm." "Was it indeed?" the woman asked, her tone now carrying an edge that could have cut glass. How convenient that the naval records of that particular voyage seemed to have been lost as well. Though I suspect if one knew where to look, one might find that the storm was considerably less natural than the official reports suggested. The implications of her words sent a chill through the assembled guests that had nothing to do with the evening air. If she was suggesting that the Duke had arranged not just for impressment but for actual murder, then they were dealing with crimes far beyond financial fraud or social manipulation. Lord Blackwood, his dark hair now disheveled despite his earlier perfect grooming, pushed through the crowd with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. "You speak of the Hartwells as if you knew them personally. But that's impossible. The family had no close connections to London society. They were minor gentry from Yorkshire, hardly the sort who would move in our circles." "Ah, Christopher," the woman said, using his given name again with that familiarity that made everyone present uncomfortable, always so focused on social connections and proper introductions. "But tell me, what if the Hartwells had connections that you never suspected? What if there were ties that bound them to this very room, to these very people, in ways that your obsession with titles and bloodlines prevented you from seeing?" She moved to the grand fireplace, its marble mantelpiece carved with cherubs and garlands that seemed to mock the increasingly dark turn of the evening's conversation. Above it hung a portrait of Lady Ashworth's great-grandmother, a woman of legendary beauty whose eyes seemed to follow the mysterious woman as she positioned herself beneath the painting. "You see," she continued, "the Hartwell family had one particular connection that would have fascinated you all, had you bothered to investigate beyond their modest estate and unremarkable title. Margaret Hartwell, the daughter of the family, was betrothed to someone whose name you would recognize, someone whose disappearance 5 years ago created quite the sensation in these very circles." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that I could hear the soft whisper of silk as ladies' gowns shifted with their nervous movements. Every person in the room was now calculating, trying to remember which young women of suitable breeding had vanished from society during that period. Lady Morrison, her earlier pallor now replaced by a flush of growing panic, stepped forward with the jerky movements of a marionette being controlled by an inexpert hand. "You speak in riddles. If you have something to say, then say it plainly. These games serve no purpose but to torment." "Torment?" The woman's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "My dear Lady Morrison, surely you of all people understand that justice often requires a period of anticipation before it can be properly served? After all, you made poor Margaret Hartwell wait 6 months between the time you spread those vicious rumors about her character and the time she finally succumbed to the pressure." Lady Morrison's hand flew to her throat as if she were suddenly unable to breathe. The diamond necklace that had seemed so beautiful earlier now appeared to be strangling her. I never. Those rumors were. There was evidence. Evidence. The woman's voice cracked like a whip. "You mean the forged letters you commissioned? The ones supposedly written in Margaret's hand, describing intimate encounters that never occurred? The witnesses you paid to claim they had seen her in compromising positions?" The crowd was beginning to murmur now, a low rumble of voices as the pieces of a 5-year-old scandal began to reassemble themselves in the light of these new revelations. I remembered the incident now. A young woman of good family whose reputation had been systematically destroyed by a series of increasingly damaging rumors that had eventually driven her from society entirely. Countess Pemberton, her emerald gown now wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, demanded, "But why? Why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to destroy an innocent young woman? What could possibly be gained?" "An excellent question, your ladyship," the mysterious woman replied. What indeed could be gained by destroying Margaret Hartwell's reputation so thoroughly that her engagement was broken, her family disgraced, and her father's business partnerships dissolved overnight? She paused, allowing the question to hang in the air like smoke from the flickering candles. Perhaps the answer lies in understanding who benefited from the Hartwell family's destruction, who gained access to their Yorkshire properties, who acquired their shipping interests at a fraction of their value, who married the man who had been betrothed to Margaret after her convenient disappearance from society. The woman's violet eyes fixed upon Lady Morrison with laser precision. Tell me, Lady Morrison, how exactly did you meet your dear departed husband? Was it before or after Margaret Hartwell's tragic leap from Dover's cliffs? The accusation hung in the air like a guillotine blade, sharp and final. Lady Morrison's face had gone from flush to ashen to a sickly green that made several guests step back in alarm. It wasn't. The marriage was arranged long before. Was it indeed? The woman pressed. How fascinating that the marriage contracts were dated only 2 weeks after Margaret's presumed death. Remarkable efficiency in mourning, wouldn't you say? Lord Blackwood, his voice cracking with strain, interrupted desperately. Even if all this is true, and I'm not saying it is, what does it matter now? The past is past. Margaret Hartwell is dead. Nothing can change that. The woman turned those penetrating violet eyes upon him, and for a moment, I could swear I saw something flicker behind them. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of a love that had been murdered along with its bearer. Is she Christopher? She asked softly. Are you so certain of that? Her hands moved to the ribbons of her mask again, and this time, there was no hesitation in her movements. The black lace fell away like autumn leaves, revealing a face that I recognized with a shock that ran through me like lightning. But as the mask fell away, revealing features that should have been familiar to half the room, one question burned brighter than all others. If Margaret Hartwell was indeed alive, what terrible justice had she planned for those who had tried to destroy her, and how many of them would survive the night? The moment the mask fell away, the ballroom erupted into chaos unlike anything I had witnessed in my decades of observing high society's most dramatic moments. Gasps of recognition mixed with cries of disbelief, creating a symphony of shock that seemed to reverberate off the crystal chandeliers and painted ceiling. For there, standing in the center of Lady Ashworth's grand ballroom, was indeed Margaret Hartwell, a woman who had been mourned, forgotten, and whose supposed death had allowed others to profit from her destruction. Yet this was not the Margaret Hartwell that London society remembered. Gone was the soft-spoken young woman with gentle eyes and modest mannerisms. In her place stood a figure transformed by 5 years of careful planning, hardened by betrayal, and refined by a burning desire for justice that had been her only companion through the long nights of exile. Her auburn hair, which had once been arranged in the simple styles befitting a country gentleman's daughter, now gleamed with sophisticated highlights and was dressed in an elaborate style that spoke of wealth and worldly experience. Her violet eyes, which had once held only innocence and trust, now burned with an intelligence sharpened by suffering and a determination that made even the most powerful men in the room step backward. But it was more than just her physical transformation that created such a dramatic impact. There was something in her bearing, in the way she held herself, that spoke of power acquired through struggle rather than inherited through birthright. She had become something that England's aristocracy had never encountered before. Someone who had been destroyed by their machinations yet had somehow found the strength not just to survive, but to return more formidable than ever. Lord Blackwood's face had gone through such a transformation that he was barely recognizable as the confident aristocrat who had entered the ballroom hours earlier. His dark eyes, which had once regarded Margaret with the casual affection of a man secure in his superior position, now stared at her with naked terror. "Margaret," he whispered, her name falling from his lips like a prayer or perhaps a curse. "But, you're dead." I saw the reports. The clothing found on the cliffs. The searches. You threw yourself from Dover." "Did I, Christopher?" Margaret's voice carried none of the soft Yorkshire accent that had once marked her as provincial in the eyes of London society. Instead, she spoke with the cultured tones of someone who had spent years perfecting her elocution, perhaps in the salons of Paris or the drawing rooms of Vienna. "Or did I simply allow you all to believe what you needed to believe in order to absolve yourselves of guilt for what you had done?" She moved toward him with deliberate steps, each footfall echoing in the hushed ballroom like the ticking of a clock counting down to judgment. "Tell me, Christopher, did you mourn me? Even for a moment? Or were you too busy celebrating your freedom from an inconvenient engagement to spare a thought for the woman whose reputation you helped destroy?" The crowd watched in fascination as this confrontation unfolded. Here was drama beyond anything they had ever witnessed. A woman literally returned from the dead to confront her betrayers. It was like something from a Gothic novel, Yet it was happening before their very eyes in the most exclusive ballroom in London. Lady Morrison, her earlier defiance now completely crumbled, collapsed into a nearby chair with such force that her diamond necklace scattered across the marble floor like fallen stars. "This is impossible," she moaned. "You were seen. The clothing. The letter you left behind. Everyone knows you chose death rather than face the shame." Shame. Margaret's laughter was like silver bells with an undertone of steel. "The only shame, Caroline, belonged to those who orchestrated my destruction. Yes, clothing was found on the cliffs. Yes, a letter was discovered. But did anyone ever find a body?" The question sent a chill through the assembled guests that was almost physical in its impact. They had all accepted the story of Margaret Hartwell's suicide because it had been convenient to do so. It had allowed them to close a chapter that had become uncomfortable, to move on with their lives without dwelling on the consequences of their actions. "You see," Margaret continued, "staging one's own death requires considerable planning and resources. Fortunately, I had both. The Hartwell family may have been modest by your standards, but we were not without means or connections. And there are those in this world who understand the value of justice, even when it must be pursued through unconventional methods." Duke Whitmore, his earlier composure now completely shattered, stepped forward with the desperation of a man trying to salvage a situation that had already spiraled beyond all control. "What do you want? Money? Restoration of your family's properties? Name your price." "My price." Margaret's violet eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that made several guests look away in discomfort. "Your Grace, do you truly believe that 5 years of exile, 5 years of watching from the shadows as you all profited from my family's destruction, can be compensated with mere money?" She moved to the center of the ballroom again, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. In the candlelight, her burgundy gown seemed to shimmer like liquid fire, and I noticed that pinned to her bodice was a brooch that several of the older guests would have recognized. The Hartwell family crest, a phoenix rising from flames. "Let me tell you what I've learned during my time away," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "I've learned that justice is not something that can be purchased or negotiated. It is something that must be earned through truth, through exposure, through forcing those who have committed crimes to face the consequences of their actions." She reached into a small beaded reticule that hung from her wrist and withdrew a thick packet of papers bound with a black ribbon. The sight of these documents sent a visible shudder through the crowd, for everyone suspected they contained evidence that could destroy reputations, end careers, and perhaps even result in criminal prosecution. "These papers," she announced, "contain 5 years' worth of careful documentation. Bank records, correspondence, witness statements, photographic evidence, everything necessary to prove not only the conspiracy that destroyed my family, but the numerous other crimes that have been committed by the supposed pillars of English society." Countess Pemberton, her emerald gown now disheveled from nervous movement, stepped forward with the desperation of a woman watching her world crumble. "Margaret, surely we can reach some understanding. You were wronged, yes, but destroying all of us will not undo the past. Will it not?" Margaret's smile was beautiful and terrible to behold. "You speak of the past as if it were some distant memory that has no bearing on the present. But tell me, Victoria, what of the families that have been destroyed since mine? What of the workers who have died in unsafe conditions while their employers counted profits? What of the poor who have starved while charity funds were diverted to maintain your luxurious lifestyles?" She held up the packet of papers like a torch, and in the flickering candlelight, it seemed to glow with an inner fire. "The past, you see, is not past at all. It is present in every corrupt decision you make, every innocent life you destroy, every time you use your power to protect your interests at the expense of justice." Lord Blackwood, his voice cracking with emotion, made one final desperate appeal. "Margaret, what we had together. Surely that means something? I cared for you. I mourned you. If I could undo what happened. What we had." Margaret's voice carried such contempt that several guests winced. "Christopher, what we had was an illusion created by your need for my family's property and my naive belief that you possessed something resembling honor. But caring for someone means protecting them, standing by them when they are attacked. You not only failed to defend me, you actively participated in my destruction the moment it became convenient for you to do so." The weight of her words seemed to settle over him like a physical burden. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I had known him, Lord Christopher Blackwood looked like a broken man. So what now? Duke Whitmore demanded, his voice harsh with desperation. You expose us all? Destroy our families? Bring down the very foundations of English society? To what end? Margaret's smile was enigmatic as she moved toward the great windows that looked out over London's gaslit streets. Beyond the glass, the city sprawled like a living organism, its millions of inhabitants going about their lives unaware that in this grand ballroom, the fate of their social order was being decided. The foundations of English society, she repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Your Grace, what kind of foundations are they if they can only be maintained through lies, corruption, and the systematic oppression of anyone who threatens your privileged position? She turned back to face the assembled guests, and in her violet eyes, I could see the fire of someone who had been tested in ways that few could imagine and had emerged not broken, but forged into something harder and more dangerous than any of them had ever encountered. I am going to give you a choice, she announced. All of you. A choice that none of you ever gave to those whose lives you destroyed. The papers in her hand seemed to pulse with potential energy, like a bomb waiting to explode. Every person in the room understood that their fate hung in the balance, that this woman who had returned from the grave held the power to destroy them all. But what choice could she possibly offer that would satisfy justice while allowing any of them to survive the reckoning that 5 years of careful planning had prepared? The silence that followed Margaret's declaration was so profound that I could hear the soft whisper of settling ash in the fireplace, and the distant sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones outside. Every person in the ballroom stood frozen, as if trapped in a tableau that would determine not just their individual fates, but the very nature of English society itself. The packet of papers in Margaret's hands had become the focal point of every eye, representing as it did the potential destruction of everything they had spent their lives building. Margaret moved to the grand piano that stood in one corner of the ballroom, its polished surface reflecting the candlelight like dark water. She placed the papers carefully on its lid, her movements deliberate and precise. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of authority that would have been unimaginable from the naive young woman who had once graced these same social circles. The choice I offer you, she began, is this: redemption through action or destruction through exposure. You have 1 year. Exactly 1 year from this night, to prove that you can use your wealth and power for something other than your own aggrandizement. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. They had expected threats, demands for money, perhaps even calls for public humiliation. But this was something none of them had anticipated. I have prepared a list of, let us call them, requirements, Margaret continued. Each of you who participated in the destruction of my family, or who has used your position to harm innocents, will have specific tasks to complete. These are not suggestions or requests. They are the price of your continued existence in polite society. Duke Whitmore, his face flushed with indignation, stepped forward. You cannot simply dictate terms to us. We are not your servants to be commanded. Are you not? Margaret's violet eyes fixed upon him with laser precision. Tell me, Your Grace, what exactly do you believe you are? You have spent decades treating other human beings as if they existed solely for your benefit. You have manipulated laws, corrupted officials, and destroyed lives without a second thought. What makes you think you deserve better treatment than you have given others? She moved to stand before him, and despite her smaller stature, there was something in her presence that made the Duke step backward. Your task, Duke Whitmore, is perhaps the most challenging of all. You will liquidate your holdings in the coal mines of Yorkshire and Wales. The same mines where safety regulations are ignored and workers die regularly to maintain your profit margins. You will use the proceeds to establish a fund for the families of men who have been killed or injured in your mines, and you will personally oversee the implementation of safety measures that meet the highest international standards. Impossible, the Duke sputtered. The costs would be astronomical. It would bankrupt. Yes, Margaret interrupted coolly. It would significantly reduce your wealth. Perhaps you would have to sell one of your estates, or reduce the size of your staff, or, heaven forbid, live more modestly. Tell me, Your Grace, do you consider that a fate worse than the deaths of the miners whose blood has paid for your comfort? The stark reality of her words hit the assembled guests like a physical blow. They were beginning to understand that Margaret had not returned seeking revenge in the conventional sense. She had returned to force them to confront the true cost of their privileged existence. Lord Blackwood, his voice barely above a whisper, asked, "And what? What would you require of me?" Margaret's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been if her life had taken a different path. "Christopher, your task is perhaps the most personal. You will use your influence in Parliament to champion legislation protecting women from the kind of character assassination that was used against me. You will create legal remedies for those whose reputations have been destroyed by malicious gossip and false accusations." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of sadness that made the entire room lean forward to catch her words. "You will also establish a foundation in memory of Margaret Hartwell, the woman I was before you all destroyed her, to provide education and opportunities for young women from modest families who might otherwise be vulnerable to the machinations of those more powerful than themselves." The psychological impact of being forced to memorialize his own victim was not lost on anyone present. Lord Blackwood's face had gone through so many transformations that he looked like a man aging years in minutes. Lady Morrison, her voice cracking with desperation, managed to ask, "And me? What would you have me do?" "Caroline," Margaret replied, using her given name with a familiarity that emphasized how intimately she had studied her enemies. "You will confess publicly to your role in spreading the false rumors that destroyed my reputation. You will provide evidence of the forgeries you commissioned and the witnesses you paid. And then you will use your considerable talents for creative storytelling to expose the true stories of other women who have been silenced by scandal. But that would mean my own reputation would be ruined. My marriage, my position in society." "Yes," Margaret agreed simply. "It would mean experiencing exactly what you put me through, with one crucial difference. Your destruction would be based on truth rather than lies." The elegant Lady Morrison collapsed back into her chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. Margaret continued methodically through the room, addressing each person who had played a role in her family's destruction, or who had used their power to harm others. To Countess Pemberton, she assigned the task of opening her account books to public scrutiny, and using her shipping empire to provide fair employment rather than exploitative labor practices. To Sir Edmund, she mandated the complete overhaul of his factory's safety standards and the establishment of compensation funds for injured workers. Each assignment was carefully crafted not just to undo specific wrongs, but to force the recipients to confront the human cost of their actions. It was a form of justice more sophisticated and potentially more devastating than simple revenge. "But what assurance do we have," asked Lord Pemberton, his voice trembling with barely controlled panic, "that completing these tasks will satisfy you? How do we know you won't simply expose us anyway once we've complied?" Margaret smiled, and there was something almost merciful in the expression. "You have my word, which I know means little to you since you've all proven how little value you place on honor. But you also have practical considerations. If you comply with my requirements, the evidence I possess becomes irrelevant. The crimes will have been acknowledged and remedied. The victims will have been compensated. Justice will have been served." She moved to the window again, looking out over the city that sprawled below them. "But if you refuse or if you attempt to comply only superficially while continuing your corrupt practices, then these documents will find their way not just to the newspapers, but to the proper authorities. And I assure you, 5 years of careful preparation has given me connections in places you cannot imagine." The weight of her threat settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. These were people accustomed to having choices, to being able to buy their way out of difficulties, to using their influence to avoid consequences. Now they found themselves trapped in a situation where their only options were genuine reform or complete destruction. Duke Whitmore, his voice hollow with defeat, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "And what of you, Margaret? What do you gain from all this? What becomes of your life now that you've revealed yourself?" Margaret turned from the window, and in her violet eyes, I saw something that surprised me: peace. Not the peace of someone who had achieved revenge, but the deeper peace of someone who had found a purpose worth the sacrifices required to fulfill it. "I gain the knowledge that the deaths and suffering caused by your greed will finally be addressed," she said simply. "As for my life, that ended 5 years ago on the cliffs of Dover, what stands before you now is something different. A force for justice that will continue to watch, to document, and to act whenever the powerful forget that their privilege comes with responsibilities. The implications of her words sent a chill through the assembled guests. She was not just seeking to settle old scores. She was establishing herself as a permanent guardian against the kind of corruption that had destroyed her family. But as the guests contemplated the impossible choice between exposure and redemption, one final question hung in the air. Could people who had spent their entire lives believing themselves above moral consequences truly transform themselves? Or would Margaret Hartwell's grand experiment in justice ultimately prove that some stains on the soul could never be washed clean? The first pale light of dawn had begun to filter through the tall windows of Lady Ashworth's ballroom, mixing with the flickering candlelight to create an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to exist between worlds, between the old order that had ruled English society for generations and whatever new reality Margaret Hartwell's revelations would create. The assembled guests, who had entered the ballroom hours earlier as the unchallenged masters of their universe, now stood like defendants awaiting judgment, their finery wrinkled, their composure shattered, their futures hanging in the balance. I watched with fascination as the true character of each individual began to emerge under the pressure of Margaret's ultimatum. Some, like Duke Whitmore, maintained their defiant posture even in defeat, their aristocratic pride preventing them from accepting the justice of their situation. Others, like Lady Morrison, had collapsed entirely under the weight of their exposed crimes, reduced to sobbing figures who bore little resemblance to the confident socialites they had been mere hours before. Margaret herself stood silhouetted against the dawn-lit windows, her burgundy gown now seeming less like an evening dress and more like the robes of some ancient goddess of justice. The packet of papers still rested on the piano, its black ribbon catching the early light like a promise of either salvation or destruction, depending upon the choices that would be made in the coming days. "I can see in your faces," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom, "that many of you are already calculating how to escape the consequences I have laid before you. You are wondering if you can discredit me, if you can use your influence to suppress the evidence I have gathered, if you can somehow return to the comfortable corruption that has defined your lives." She moved away from the windows, her steps echoing in the vast space like the footfalls of fate itself. "Let me save you the trouble of such planning. I have spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and I have not done so carelessly. Copies of all the evidence I possess have been placed in the hands of individuals beyond your reach or influence. Should anything unfortunate happen to me, or should you fail to fulfill your obligations, those documents will automatically be released to every major newspaper in London, as well as to the appropriate legal authorities." Lord Blackwood, his dark hair now disheveled and his face bearing the ravaged look of a man confronting the ruins of his carefully constructed life, stepped forward with the mechanical movements of someone operating purely on instinct. "Margaret," he said, and her name seemed to catch in his throat like a physical obstruction. What you're asking is not just difficult, it would mean the end of everything we've built." "Everything you've built," Margaret repeated, and there was something almost gentle in her voice, as if she were speaking to a child who had finally begun to understand the consequences of their actions. "Christopher, what exactly do you think you have built? Wealth based on the suffering of others? Influence purchased through corruption? Respect founded on lies and intimidation?" She moved closer to him, and I could see the transformation that 5 years of exile and planning had wrought in her. Where once there had been the soft features of a young woman raised in comfort and protected from the harsh realities of the world, there was now the refined strength of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged harder, clearer, more focused than before. "Tell me," she continued, "what value does a building have if its foundation is rotten? How long can a structure stand when every beam is compromised, every support corroded by greed and selfishness? What you call everything we've built is nothing more than an elaborate facade concealing a moral wasteland." The truth of her words hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking. Around the room, I could see the carefully maintained masks of civilization beginning to slip as the guests confronted the reality of what they had become. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their crimes. Others stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the complete reversal of their fortunes. A few maintained their defiant postures, but even they seemed smaller now, diminished by the exposure of their true nature. Countess Pemberton, Her emerald gown now hopelessly wrinkled and her elaborate coiffure collapsed into disarray, raised a trembling hand to her throat where her diamond necklace had once gleamed. "But the scandal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The damage to our family's names. Our children will bear the consequences of our mistakes for generations." "Yes," Margaret agreed with devastating simplicity. "They will. Just as the children of those you have wronged have borne the consequences of your actions. Just as the families of workers killed in unsafe mines have endured poverty and grief while you counted your profits. Just as my own family name was destroyed to serve your ambitions." She paused, allowing the weight of this truth to settle over the gathering like a heavy blanket. "But here is what you fail to understand, Victoria. Your children will bear the consequences of your choices, but they will also have the opportunity to make different choices. They can choose to rebuild your family's reputation through honorable actions, rather than inherited privilege. They can choose to earn respect through service rather than demand it through intimidation." Margaret moved to the center of the ballroom one final time, positioning herself where every person could see her clearly. In the growing dawn light, she seemed almost translucent, as if she were fading back into the shadows from which she had emerged. "You have 1 year," she repeated, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. 1 year to prove that redemption is possible, that people who have spent their lives serving only themselves can learn to serve something greater. 1 year to demonstrate that the power and wealth you have accumulated can be used to heal rather than harm. She retrieved the packet of papers from the piano, holding them against her chest like a shield. "I will be watching as I have watched for the past 5 years. I will know if your efforts are genuine or merely theatrical. I will know if you are truly seeking to make amends or simply trying to buy your way out of consequences." Duke Whitmore, his earlier bluster now completely evaporated, asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "And if we succeed? If we fulfill your requirements, what then?" Margaret's smile was enigmatic, carrying layers of meaning that no one in the room could fully fathom. "Then you will have learned something that your wealth and titles could never teach you. That true power comes not from the ability to control others, but from the strength to control oneself. That genuine respect is earned through sacrifice, not purchased through influence. That the only legacy worth leaving is one that makes the world better for your having been in it." She began to move toward the door, her burgundy gown flowing behind her like liquid fire in the dawn light. As she walked, she spoke one final time, her words carrying across the ballroom like a benediction or perhaps a curse. "The woman you destroyed 5 years ago is indeed dead, buried beneath the weight of your betrayals and machinations. But from her grave has risen something far more dangerous to those who prey upon the innocent, a guardian who will never rest, never forget, and never allow the powerful to escape the consequences of their choices." She paused at the threshold, turning back to face the assembled guests one last time. "Choose wisely," she said simply. "The world is watching, and I am watching the world." And then she was gone, vanishing into the gray dawn like a specter returning to whatever realm had sheltered her during her years of exile and preparation. The assembled guests stood in stunned silence, staring at the doorway through which their judge and possibly their salvation had departed. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their bronze voices carrying across London's awakening streets with news of a new day. But for the people gathered in Lady Ashworth's ballroom, this was not merely a new day. It was the beginning of a year that would determine whether redemption was truly possible for those who had spent their lives believing themselves above the reach of justice. As the last echoes of Margaret Hartwell's footsteps faded into memory, each person in that grand room faced the same terrible question. Could they find the courage to become worthy of the mercy they had been offered, or would their pride and greed prove stronger than their desire for redemption? The game of consequences had begun, and the stakes could not have been higher. Not just their fortunes or reputations, but their very souls hung in the balance. Only time would tell whether the dawn that now filled the ballroom with pale light would prove to be the beginning of their salvation, or the illumination of their final judgment. In the growing light of that new day, Margaret Hartwell's challenge echoed through the empty corridors of power. Could those who had spent their lives destroying others finally learn to build something worthy of the legacy they would leave behind? The answer would determine not just their individual fates, but the very future of a society that had forgotten that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the courage to stand for justice, even when, especially when, that justice demands the highest price of all.